I'd also like to acknowledge funding. I'm very fortunate to have a K-23 Career Development Award from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And I also was very fortunate to get some pilot funding from the BU CTSI, who's supporting this work and putting on the symposium today. So these are the opioid overdose death rates for the country from 2001 to 2016. And as earlier speakers noted, things are increasing and unfortunately seem to be accelerating in the last few years. And the question here is, what are we going to do to try and bend this curve? And that's one of the main objectives to people working in this area. Some of you may have seen an article in the New York Times a few months ago where one of their reporters surveyed 30 stakeholders with involvement in the opioid crisis and said, how would you spend $100 billion? If I had $100 billion, how would you divvy that up to address this crisis? Michael Botticelli was one of them, Alex Wally, so we were well represented here in that panel of 30. And here's the summary of what they said. They bucketed all of the interventions into 4 categories. And I'm going to highlight treatment and harm reduction here, got 62% of the dollars spent. And so these, I would say, are focusing on people who already have an opioid use disorder or opioid use issues. But this begs the question, if we're going to spend $62 billion on treatment and harm reduction, how are we going to decide where to deliver those services? Who are we going to deliver them to? And what services are we going to deliver? So the title of my talk dealt with touchpoints, and I just want to define what I'm talking about when I say touchpoint. And we're defining this as a healthcare, public health, or criminal justice system encounter that gives you an opportunity to identify someone who's at high risk of dying from an opioid overdose. And because this is a face-to-face encounter, it gives you the opportunity to deliver harm reduction services and or engage them in treatment. So if we think about what an ideal touch point would look like, we would be able to readily identify them. It would identify people who are at high risk of going on to die of an opioid-related death. And if you look backward from the number of people or the people who actually end up dying from opioid-related death, you identify a large proportion of them through these touch points. So being high risk alone would not be enough if only a small number of the people that go on to die had encountered that touch point. And finally, you'd want to have effective interventions that you could deliver in order to reduce mortality. So I'm going to tell you about 2 studies in lines of work we're using the Massachusetts data to work on. And the first is we want to look at 8 candidate touch points to identify what are the opioid mortality rates after encountering these touch points, and what proportion of opioid overdose deaths in the state are preceded by these touch points. Then we're going to dive a little deeper in one of those touch points. Commissioner Burrell alluded to some of this work in her talk, but we're going to look at non-fatal opioid overdose and identify who's getting medication for opioid use disorder after that, and then look at the association between receipt of a medication and who goes on to die. So the data source we used was what's been referred to as the Chapter 55 data set, and this came out of legislation in Massachusetts that directed the Department of Public Health to use available data to improve the understanding and response to the opioid crisis. As Commissioner Burrell summarized, there we had a wealth of data at the state, but that data was separated among many departments and even within some departments within different agencies. And this law needed to be passed that would allow us to combine that data at an individual level and try and gain insight from it. One of the main concerns was privacy, and in the era of big data, this is an understandable concern. And there was really an elegant multi-layered approach I'm not going to dive into the details of to really protect privacy that really prevents anyone who's using these data at the end platform to re-identify individuals. So the spine of this data set, the backbone of the data set is the all-payer claims database. So in Massachusetts, we're fortunate that 98% of our residents have health insurance. And so we think this is a near population level data set. There's more than 6 million individuals represented. And this data set was then linked at the individual level out to about 20 other data sources. I'm going to share 6 with you that are involved in the studies we use. This includes the prescription monitoring program that contains all controlled substance prescriptions dispensed in the state, substance use treatment data, ambulance encounters, death records, including data from the medical examiner and the state accepted definition of opioid overdose death. We're getting data from the Department and Houses of Corrections to know when people are coming in and out of jail, and hospital and emergency room encounters. As you can imagine, this gives us a much more comprehensive view of what's happening to individuals affected by this crisis than any one of these data sources alone. So now let's talk about the touch points we're going to focus on, and I'm going to group them into two main categories. And the first is prescribing, and this is something that's gotten a lot of attention. And so we identified 4 high-risk opioid prescribing touch points that you could find in prescription monitoring program data. And several studies have identified that these 4 that we picked are associated with high risk of opioid-related harms. And they include high dosages, combining an opioid with a benzodiazepine, or individuals getting prescriptions from multiple prescribers or going to multiple pharmacies. But beyond prescribing, there are other encounters and opportunities we have to see people who are at risk for opioid-related harms. And so we looked at 4 non-prescribing touch points we could identify in the data. One is someone going into opioid detoxification. The second is someone surviving an opioid overdose, and we could identify them in 2 ways. One is someone who had an ambulance encounter, and the second is someone who was treated for an overdose in the hospital setting. The next are people coming to us in the hospital or emergency room setting with complications of intravenous drug use. So these are skin soft tissue infections or endocarditis. And then lastly would be release from incarceration. So we took all residents in Massachusetts age 11 years or older. The unit of analysis here was the person month. We had almost 7 million person years represented. We focused on calendar year 2014, and I'm just going to show you how we set the data up so you can understand the analysis. These are 4 sample subjects, and we looked at every person month where someone was alive in the data. And in each of those months, we tried to identify, did you have an exposure to a touch point? So hypothetical scenarios here in green are when someone had been exposed to a touch point in that month or in the prior 12 months. Then we overlaid on that, when did people have an opioid-related death? And with this data structure, we developed 2 outcomes. The first was the standardized mortality ratio, which we define as the observed deaths following one of these touch points compared to the expected rate of deaths for someone that had not experienced that touch point. The second is population attributable fraction. This is a little bit of a complex concept, but it's the proportion of deaths in the population. So this is how many of the opioid-related deaths in Massachusetts could be prevented if we found someone with one of these exposures and made their risk the same as someone that hadn't had that exposure. Okay, so how many of the deaths can we prevent after each of these touch points? So let's look at the results. Here we have the standardized mortality ratios following high-risk touch points. The high-risk prescribing, the standardized mortality ratio is 13. That means you're 13 times more likely to die of an opioid overdose after one of these prescribing touch points. If you look at the non-prescribing touch points, the standardized mortality ratio is 65. When we look at the individual touch points, I'll just point out that the highest risk touch point, perhaps not surprisingly, is surviving an overdose, 111 times the risk of someone that had not survived an overdose. So you might say, okay, well, this is all well and good, but how many of the people can we find if we look at these touch points? And that's what the population attributable fraction helps us with. And so let's look. If you had any touch point, we identify 52% of the people prior to death. That's any of the 8 touch points. High-risk prescribing touch points are 19%. Non-prescribing touch points are 39%, and then the individual numbers down below. The highest population attributable fraction was after detox at 21% and 17% for non-fatal opioid overdose. So to summarize here, we can find more than half of the people who are going to die from an opioid overdose by one of these 8 high-risk touch points. We can identify them in public health data. And these touch points, we think, present an opportunity to develop and deliver both harm reduction interventions and engage people in treatment. So that brings us to the second objective here, is to dive deeper into one of these touch points. We're going to look at non-fatal overdose and look at one particular intervention, which is medications for opioid use disorder. So despite all of the really awful statistics around this disorder, there's reason for hope in that we have treatments that we know work. Okay, there are 3 FDA-approved medications for opioid use disorder: methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. And many randomized controlled trials have shown their benefit to reduce cravings, increase treatment retention, reduce illicit opioid use. And we even have observational evidence for methadone and buprenorphine that they reduce mortality. One of the benefits of this data set is that it actually allows us to see all 3 of these medications, which hadn't been previously able to be done. We can identify naltrexone from claims from the all-payer claims database. Buprenorphine prescriptions are included in the prescription monitoring program. And methadone either shows up in the all-payer claims database, but until recently was very rarely covered by commercial insurance. And we, by combining the data with the substance addiction services data from the state, we could identify people who are receiving methadone. The outcome we were interested in was time to opioid-related mortality in the first 12 months. We built multivariable Cox regressions adjusting for demographic characteristics and other treatment characteristics. I want to spend a minute talking about how we classified exposure to medication. We treated this as a time-varying covariate. And here's a cartoon or schematic of an individual who received treatment noted by, there we go, the green bars here. So this individual would have received a medication in months 1, 2, and 3. They actually received the medication, but not in month 4. And so in what we're calling the on-treatment classification, we consider people exposed only in months where they actually got the treatment. But we took a second look that we called through discontinuation, and the reason we did this is we know from other studies that the period of discontinuation is really high risk. So people who stop using a medication have a very high risk of opioid-related harms. And if stopping a treatment increases your risk, we should attribute that risk to the treatment itself. So we looked at it these 2 ways. We were able to identify almost 18,000 people who survived an overdose between 2012 and 2014. 62% were male, and 2/3 were under age 45. So here's how we did with getting people to medication. Only 30%, or 3 out of 10, got at least 1 month of one of these 3 medications. Okay, this is once, 1 out of 12 months. 17% got buprenorphine, and those that did got it for a median of 4 months. 11% got methadone for a median of 5 months, and 6% got naltrexone, and those that got naltrexone got it for only a median of 1 month, so people are not staying on that medication. Here's looking at those data another way, where we're just looking monthly in the 12 months prior to and 12 months following non-fatal overdose, who is receiving which treatments. The gray line in the middle is the time of the index overdose. This is the 12 months before and the 12 months after. You can see very slight increases in buprenorphine or methadone, but as Commissioner Burrell talked about too, like when we're looking at only, in a monthly level, only 6 or 7% are getting buprenorphine or methadone and only about 1% getting naltrexone. Here we see this increase in naltrexone right after the overdose, but that reverts right back down afterward. 807 people died after this event in the 12 months following. There were 368 that were classified as opioid-related. These translate to incidence rates of 4.7 per 100 person years of follow-up, or 2.1 per 100 person years of follow-up. So these are, again, people under 45 years of age. 5 out of 100 you could expect to die in the next year. Here's what happens if we put people on medication. This is the on-treatment response. So let me orient you. These are hazard ratios. If you're not familiar with looking at these, 1 would indicate no effect. Anything on this side of the chart indicates protection, reduced mortality, and anything on this side would be increased mortality. So all 3 treatments seem to have an effect. For buprenorphine and methadone, 70% reduction in mortality. So if you're on a medication. For naltrexone, where it's very difficult to have any confident conclusions. There's a wide confidence interval here, and that really reflects the small number of people who are on that medication. When we look at the through discontinuation analysis, the effect seems to attenuate for each of the treatments, but remains a significantly, statistically significant reduction for buprenorphine and methadone, 40% and 60% respectively. Naltrexone turns to a hazard ratio of 1.4, but again, wide confidence intervals make it difficult to draw too many conclusions there. So our conclusions here are that this may be a missed opportunity. We have very high one-year mortality for people who survive an overdose. Buprenorphine and methadone are associated with a reduced risk of opioid-related death, but only a minority of people are getting medications following non-fatal opioid overdose. The duration of treatment is low, particularly for naltrexone. So if we come back to what I specified for our candidate touch points, I would say, yes, we have these 8 touch points. They're readily identifiable. We use public health data. We can see them. The risk of opioid-related death after these touch points is very high, around 13 if you had a prescribing touch point, 65 if you had a non-prescribing touch point. We can identify more than half of individuals before they die of an overdose. And then the question is, what are we going to do to reduce mortality? So I've shown you that medication use is associated with reduced mortality. The question is, how are we going to deliver these services and get more people engaged in those treatments? I think I want to hammer home that these are all encounters where someone presented with a face-to-face encounter where it was clear that this person has an opioid use disorder and is at very high risk, and you have the opportunity to deliver harm reduction or treatment, and we're clearly not doing that. So I think this gives us a map in a public health system of how to approach this. So I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks.
One, maybe 2 questions.
Michael. Yeah.
So Marc, I was struck by some data that talked about even after discontinuation of treatment with methadone and buprenorphine, there still seemed to be some protective factor involved versus not seeing a protective factor after discontinuation. What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, so just to clarify that point, this is still, people are at risk after discontinuing. So this is not an approach that said once you stopped, you're not at risk. So it's showing the risk in that, only taking into account that first month after stopping. Okay? So, but it's a great question in what's happening. And I think we have emerging really at the level of anecdotes now, case reports of concern, particularly with naltrexone. When I show these data, I think the buprenorphine and methadone people get, right? And the naltrexone data are what draws people's attention, and is it possible that we could be harming people by putting high-risk individuals on naltrexone? There was a recent series of case reports that identified people who are dying in the month following stopping naltrexone. So this is something, though, that we need more attention to in research to really understand. But something that these data may raise concern, but again, the small number of individuals really precludes any kind of confident conclusion there.
How do you channel the identifiable touch points into efficient ways to notify the caregivers for intervention?
So that's a great...
State health, yearly data.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So the prescription monitoring program, the prescribing touch points are clearly already in that, in the prescription monitoring program. I would argue we should leverage that system that's already put in place to include these other touch points as well, so that you can alert, it's only there if you go to look for another reason, if you're considering making a prescription. That would require some legislative change, right, to change the mandate of what's included in the prescription monitoring program. It would require some level of reporting. We do this with infectious disease that are serious. But if you report it out on non-fatal overdoses, or the state has data on who's going into detox, but those flags might be really helpful for a practitioner out in the community and give additional opportunities beyond the original face-to-face encounter where someone might not be willing at that stage and ready to engage at that particular time.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Nice work.